You also write articles such as How Ukraine Wins, and regarding this summit also, what is Ukrainian victory in this defensive war, in your opinion?
Well, I think that Ukraine will win, and I think that the West will help Ukraine win, but we are not completely there yet. The West is still being excessively cautious, is too concerned about escalation, and is not putting all the tools on the table that we should. I think a comprehensive strategy for helping Ukraine win the war should be, in the first instance, military. So we should provide the weapons that Ukraine needs, and we should lift restrictions on Ukraine's use of those weapons, because Ukraine is fighting for self-defense. The only restriction should be international law itself, which gives Ukraine the right to self-defense and requires hitting only military targets, not civilian targets. But any further restrictions should not be applied. The second is that we should help Ukraine, particularly protecting civilians, cities, civilian infrastructure, economic sources of production. These are things that we did to help Israel recently. There's no reason we cannot also help Ukraine directly with air defense. And if we do, it'll free up Ukrainian resources to have further protection in the east, where the front lines are. And it will also give greater confidence to investors who may want to invest and rebuild Ukraine's economy. And then third, we need to see that economic recovery and economic development is part of the strategy for victory. It's not something that waits till the end of the war, something we have to do now. And then finally, NATO membership for Ukraine is also part of the strategy for victory. We have to make sure that Ukraine gets an invitation to join NATO as soon as possible, because this will send a clear signal to Putin that he's never going to win, never going to destroy Ukraine. The West will be there to help. And as a result, it's time to end the war. Those are the many things that we could be doing that we are so far not doing.
Yeah, you brought up this issue of NATO invitation, and for Ukrainians, it's really frustrating. Like this recent Biden statement about defense of Ukraine without NATO, and why is this happening? How Ukrainians can persuade the USA that NATO invitation doesn't mean actual participation in the war? What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, but it's one we must answer. If we tell Vladimir Putin Ukraine cannot join NATO until after the war, then that's a message to Putin to continue the war. And we want the opposite. We want him to end the war. So we have to figure out how to bring Ukraine into NATO as soon as possible. Now, what people are worried about, and President Biden is worried about, is NATO countries having to join the war against Russia immediately because of NATO Article 5, collective defense. So if Ukraine is being attacked, then we all have to fight back against Russia. And that could escalate into a wider NATO-Russia war and even escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. So that is why Biden is hesitant. But we have to address this question. We can't just ignore it or walk away and just hope for the best. We have to sit down together with Ukraine. We have to talk about what is needed for Ukraine's defense. We have to be clear what we're willing to do, such as help with air defenses, help with freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, training, equipment, ammunition, everything that Ukraine needs. And for Ukraine to make clear that at this stage, there's no requirement for Western troops to be fighting on the front line. Ukraine just needs the equipment and the ammunition and the support. And with that, we'll be able to defeat Russian forces. And also, NATO can make a commitment to Ukraine, but also a public statement that would be read by Russia that would help defend Ukrainian territory that Ukraine controls. So no more Russian seizure of territory, but would not engage to retake territory militarily alongside Ukrainian forces. That's a matter for Ukraine itself. Those are all things that NATO could do, which would make it possible to move forward with NATO sooner rather than waiting until the end of the war.
Okay, regarding this NATO, let's speak participations, limited participation, I would like to ask, should NATO even be afraid of any escalation from Russia? Because even speaking theoretically, from Ukrainian perspective, it seems really like the potential of NATO and Russia is hugely different, and why NATO should be afraid of it? So is it purely psychological reason, or indeed Russia has something that NATO should consider seriously?
Yeah. So Russia does have military capabilities that NATO should be concerned about. Nuclear weapons, primary among them. Also space and sophisticated aircraft bombing capabilities. And it also is very good in cyber attacks and in sabotage, hybrid attacks, hybrid warfare. And we see some of this already with the attacks taking place inside Western countries. And I think we could see more of it. But all that being said, those capabilities should not deter NATO from protecting itself and from helping Ukraine to protect itself. So the fact that there are risks and the fact that Russia might attack even more if they could, it shouldn't be a deterrent, because if we allow that to deter us, we're letting Vladimir Putin set the terms of security in Europe. We should be setting the terms of that.
Yeah, you also brought up the question of Black Sea security and the participation of NATO ships there. Yes. And also speaking about that, another related question about participation of NATO aircraft to shoot down missiles, for example, above Western Ukraine. Is it connected somehow, these two models of participation? Are they realistic to expect anytime sooner?
Well, to answer your last question first, I don't think that anyone will make decisions to do this, either NATO operations in the Black Sea or NATO participation in air defense in Ukraine in the near term. I think both the United States and Germany, the Biden administration, the Schultz administration, are not going to agree to this. That being said, they're completely realistic. They are things that could be done in the future, and they would be, I would argue, with minimal risk to NATO, but with significant assistance to Ukraine. There is now an agreement between Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey to provide demining assistance in the Black Sea. That is very helpful already, and I spoke last week with the foreign minister of Romania, who confirmed that this arrangement, this three-party arrangement, is open to other countries to take part as well. And I would hope that as it is established and as these three countries participate in demining in the Black Sea, other NATO countries do take part. And I hope that it becomes not just demining, but also NATO presence in the Black Sea. These would be very positive developments if it can go in that direction. As you mentioned NATO aircraft, I would not be so specific. I would say NATO air defenses, because NATO has good ground-based air defenses as well. And what is important is that we assist Ukraine with airspace coverage to protect southwestern Ukraine, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Izmail, economic core of Ukraine in terms of exports, sea-based exports. And that is indeed connected to freedom of navigation and shipping in the Black Sea. But then on top of that, we should also be able to help with territorial air defense protection, for example, around Lviv, which would allow Ukraine to free up some of its air defenses for deployment further east.
What conditions should be met so that this happens, that NATO countries deploy their air defense systems to protect these regions? And is this idea, is it worth discussing this idea, or maybe just provide air defense systems?
Well, right now, it is being discussed. You hear France talking about this, Poland, Baltic states. So people are giving it some consideration. I think even the British would consider it. But there is no agreement at NATO on this right now. So it's not going to move at the NATO summit. But there is some consideration given to this. And I would keep raising it because I think it is a legitimate and realistic idea.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, maybe also a question about money. Of course, war needs money, and you mentioned in the article 500 billions that are needed as a lend-lease program for Ukraine, which is quite a lot. Could you explain this amount?
Yeah, so that's my idea. No one is talking about that. Unlike the air defense things where people are talking on this major lend-lease package, that's my idea. What we saw for the first first 4 months of this year, it was very difficult and delayed for the US to pass supplemental budgetary authority for military assistance to Ukraine. And the delay had nothing to do with Ukraine. There were enough votes in the House and the Senate to approve this 6 months ago, but it wasn't moving for other reasons because we have issues inside the Republican Party. There's some people who have opposition to aid to Ukraine, only 6 or 7 people, but they have the ability to bring down the Speaker of the House. So that was one issue. And the substantive issue was the southern border. We are still not controlling our own border in the United States. And a lot of congressmen wanted to make sure we took action on that so that we're not only helping Ukraine, but we're also doing something for ourselves. And that still hasn't been done. So that's why it took so long. But if we think about the prospects of delays again in the future, we should put in place mechanisms that guard against such delays. I think we should provide additional military assistance to Ukraine next year in 2025, and it should be on an appropriated basis, not just a loan. But if we at the same time put in place a lend-lease program of substantial size, so that anytime Ukraine needs to borrow money to keep the defense effort going, it can, then it makes it not subject to the difficulties in our political debates and votes in Congress. So I think this is something we should do now. Doesn't even have to wait until the next Congress, but we can put this in place and give Ukraine some assurance that resources will be there if needed.
Okay, isn't in this case, isn't it more reasonable to deploy these resources, weapons at one time so that ensure Ukraine can move forward, at least in the Black Sea region, rather than delay this, extend and spend more on this prolonged war?
Absolutely, yes, I agree. We should do it now.
Okay, and then probably another question about NATO coming to an end of our 20 minutes. How, in your opinion, as also expert in NATO, how deeply has NATO transformed itself and prepared to this new type of warfare, including drone warfare? Is it sufficient or not right now?
It's completely insufficient. It is not adapted enough at all. We've gone through phases. We had the Cold War where we were thinking about the Soviet Union as a major peer adversary. And then we went through the crisis management timeframes of the wars in the Balkans where NATO was doing peacekeeping operations. And we changed our tactics, we changed our equipment, we changed our mindset. We thought that's the sort of thing, crisis management, that's the kind of thing NATO is going to need to do in the future. Then we had Afghanistan, which was also crisis management and peacekeeping, but much more intense than what was the case in the Balkans. And we thought that terrorism was one of the big things. So we were downsizing all the heavy stuff and all the sophisticated military things and moving towards lighter, more deployable forces. And now we have yet another iteration. We have sophisticated, heavily armed Russia and China with great electronics and digital capabilities and electronic warfare capabilities. We haven't planned on that. So a lot of the equipment that we have now depends on GPS, depends on signals, and Russia's able to disrupt that. So we have to adapt in that way. And in addition, drones have introduced a low-cost way to achieve similar effects to what until now we've only done with very high-cost means. and defenses against drones. We're using very expensive equipment, very expensive ammunition to shoot down very cheap drones. So this is not sustainable either. We have to adapt to the electronic warfare environment. We have to maintain high-end, sophisticated, major military capabilities, and we need to develop a whole new area of low-cost offensive and defensive capabilities with drones that will be necessary to match that part of the battle as well. So far, we are way behind. Ukraine is ahead of NATO.
And is any work already done inside NATO towards these transformations?
People are talking about it. People are aware of it, but I would not say that much work is done yet.
Okay. And maybe as a last question, which we have already discussed a little bit, but still really important. We had recently two important events. One, Ukraine destroyed Russian strategic radars against nuclear strike potential from the west, so one near Kazakhstan, another near Black Sea. And the second was that Ukraine started using Western weapons against Russian troops on the Russian soil. And both were like so-called red lines, but Russia did nothing afterwards. So
yeah.
It exposes this Russian bluff that actually red lines don't mean anything for Russia, and we can actually move forward. Why there is still this fear present in the West? Why and how we could work with it?
Yeah, you still have this fear of escalation in the West. It's hard to explain. It's not rational, but it is very deeply felt. And you're absolutely right that Putin puts out these red lines in order to deter the West from acting, not because Russia will actually do anything, doesn't even have the capability to do anything. So we shouldn't think that Russia's 10 feet tall and can do anything they want. If they could escalate today, they already would. And the fact that they're not doing so in response to these things that you mentioned indicates that they're not able to do so. And we should not be so self-deterred as we are.
Okay, thank you very much for this conversation and for your views, and hopefully we can move
Well done.
forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Glad we were able to work this out.